Good morning, DEC members. Happy Monday. No Monday Grumpies here. Everybody's going to have a great week. I'm Steve Grigorian, President and CEO of the Detroit Economic Club. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. Do want to take a brief moment to thank the 120 terrific DEC sponsors for their continued support of our mission. I also want to remind you to be sure to get your tickets for some upcoming events still in December. And then on January 12th, we open up 2021 with our annual Michigan Economic Outlook meeting. The DEC has an incredible history of speakers that we love to share. Our speaker today now joined is a distinguished list of 10 other speakers who in our 86-year history have addressed the DEC on December 7th. A few highlights. 1942, Colonel Carlos Romulo from the Philippine Army gave a speech titled The War in the Pacific, certainly timely given that today is December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. 1959, we were joined by New York Governor, Commerce Secretary, and U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Averell Harriman. And in 1964, Robert Sarnoff, the CEO of NBC TV. And today we're pleased to add Chris Whipple as our 11th speaker on this day in DEC history. So let's get started. Chris Whipple is an acclaimed writer, multimedia journalist, documentary filmmaker, and speaker. He's written for Newsweek, Vanity Fair, Politico, The Daily Beast, and is a frequent guest on the major cable news networks. Chris is a multiple Peabody and Emmy Award-winning producer at CBS's 60 Minutes and ABC's Prime Time. He's authored several books, and his latest is the reason we asked Chris to join us today. The Spymasters, How CIA Directors Shape History and the Future, is about the people who have led the world's most powerful and storied intelligence agency. It's not a formal history of the CIA, but rather a look at how its directors have helped shape a half century of world events and how they will affect the future. I read the book cover to cover. It is fascinating, and it would make a great holiday gift. And we're going to share the link in the chat box throughout our program today. So Chris, it is a pleasure to have you with us at the Detroit Economic Club. Welcome.
Steve, great to be with you. It's really an honor to be asked.
Thank you, Chris. I want to start with some context. Your book spans 7 decades of intelligence gathering, espionage, and covert warfare, and features indelible portraits of its directors. You were able to interview every living CIA director except Mike Pompeo and current director Gina Haspel. What we learned is the CIA director is the person Americans depend on to prevent another Pearl Harbor or 9/11. They're also the person who all too often must tell the president what he doesn't want to hear. So a recurring theme, Chris, throughout the book is the importance of the relationship between the CIA director and the US president. Chris, what is the proper relationship? And can you give us an example of a good relationship and one that was dysfunctional?
Sure. First of all, as you say, Steve, the book is not so much a formal history as it is just, I hope, a great yarn. And I was really blessed with the unbelievable cast of characters that I had to work with, beginning with Richard Helms back in the 1960s, who was the quintessential old school CIA guy, dry martini in one hand, cigarette in the other, who could walk into the Oval Office and tell LBJ hard truths, all the way up to Gina Haspel, the current CIA director, first woman to rise to the pinnacle of the intelligence world. And she's an incredible character, a mystery woman who came up as a covert operative. So it's a cast that John le Carré couldn't have dreamed up. So I was lucky. And as you say, the relationship between the CIA director and the president is everything. And it's an almost impossible balancing act for the CIA director, because on the one hand, he or she is the person who has to tell the president what he does not want to hear often. And at the same time, the CIA director has to have the ear of the president, because the director may run an army of analysts and covert operatives and paramilitary warriors and lethal drones, but the whole enterprise is for naught if the CIA director doesn't have a seat at the table. One example of a relationship that really worked was Leon Panetta as CIA director and Barack Obama. And here's a kind of a spoiler alert. If anybody out there is familiar with my book on the White House Chiefs of Staff, the gatekeepers, some of the qualities that make great White House Chiefs of Staff also make great CIA directors. And it's no coincidence that Leon Panetta was one of the best in both jobs. And the reason for that is that Panetta had been around the block. He knew Capitol Hill and the White House, but most of all, he had the confidence. He was grounded enough to be able to walk into the Oval Office and tell Barack Obama stuff he didn't want to hear. An example of a relationship that was a train wreck was James Woolsey and Bill Clinton. Woolsey was a brilliant technocrat. He sort of foresaw the age of drone warfare. He was brilliant, but he and Clinton just did not get along. And after the first briefing, after 40 minutes, Woolsey left and Clinton turned to one of his aides and said, "I never want to see that man again." And he almost never did. So it was a case of a really dysfunctional relationship. And the CIA, and I think national security, suffered for it.
Chris, we know the CIA has had incredible successes in disrupting terrorist plots and saving lives. But for me, some of the juiciest chapters in your book were the intelligence failures. So let's talk about some of those. Let me set the stage. It's the late 70s. This is one chapter that was particularly fascinating. It's the late 70s. You've got a chapter on the utter failure of the intelligence community under Jimmy Carter, as it is stunned by the overthrow of Iran's Shah that resulted in a hostage crisis. Tell us about that.
This was one of the really dark moments for the American intelligence community in general and the CIA in particular. And as fiascos go, I would rank it with the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion under John F. Kennedy, and with weapons of mass destruction on George W. Bush's watch. What happened was that the CIA was blindsided by the fall of the Shah, utterly underestimated, was clueless about the opposition, internal opposition to the Shah. Not only that, but they literally were not even talking to any of the opposition, including the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had decamped to a villa on the outskirts of Paris, where the entire World Press Corps was talking to him, but not the CIA. It was not entirely the CIA's fault. Part of it was that Henry Kissinger, prior to Jimmy Carter's election, had cut a deal with the Shah of Iran on behalf of the US, essentially saying, if you give us access to your listening posts along the border with the Soviet Union, and you continue to be a reliable source of oil, we won't talk to the opposition. We will rely totally on your Secret Service, the infamous SAVAK, as it was known. Well, the result was a complete disaster. I mean, the US was blindsided by this. This was a major geopolitical disaster. And the US has been really recovering from it ever since.
Richard Helms, I know, is one of your favorites. He was a CIA director from 1966 to 73.
Correct.
You write that he once described the job in succinct terms. It's not enough to ring the bell, he said, referring to foreign threats. You've got to make sure the president hears it. And with that backdrop, Chris, it's now summer 2001. Alarm bells are deafening and the CIA is screaming their heads off that an attack is imminent. And you write about a dramatic meeting in July at the White House with Condoleezza Rice and CIA Director George Tenet. Tell us more.
Yeah, it's an incredible story because I think most people have the impression, and certainly the 9/11 Commission gave the impression that 9/11 was an intelligence failure. In my view, it was not an intelligence failure. It was a policy failure. And there's an old saying at the CIA that, in this town, there's no such thing. There are only policy successes and intelligence failures, meaning that the CIA always gets blamed. On July 10, 2001, George Tenet, the CIA director, Cofer Black, who was head of the Counterterrorism Center, and Rich Blee, who speaks to me on the record about this for the first time in the book, went to the White House on an urgent mission. Cofer Black pounded his fist on the table. This was a meeting with Condi Rice, the national security advisor at the time for George W. Bush. And they told her in no uncertain terms that an attack is imminent. It's going to cost thousands of lives. And they didn't know, obviously, the exact target, but they knew that thousands of Americans would die. Black said, we have to go on a war footing now. And nothing happened, essentially. The George W. Bush's White House didn't want to hear about it. They had other priorities, including Iran. And the result was, as I say in the book, if they had called a so-called principals meeting, where you get all the heads of the departments around a table, including CIA, FBI, and everyone else, there's a very good chance that we would have discovered, the US would have known about the two hijackers, Al-Qaeda hijackers, who were already on US soil at that point and actually done something about it. But nothing happened.
I think you also write in there that, I forgot if it was the FBI, somebody knew that one of the terrorists was taking lessons on flying an aircraft, but didn't complete the section on how to land the aircraft.
Yeah, that was an FBI agent in that case. But there was a total breakdown of communication, and that's between the FBI and the CIA, and there was a real kind of Chinese wall between the two back in those days, and that's improved since then. That's a pretty familiar story, but as I say, the really sort of untold story was just how emphatic the CIA was with the George W. Bush White House months before 9/11.
Let's take a quick second and ask Christina to pop up the link again in the chat room, folks. Again, if you're looking for a great holiday gift, here's one you can consider. Chris, so let's go now post 9/11. President Bush asked the CIA to come up with evidence that ties Saddam Hussein in Iraq to Al-Qaeda and 9/11. Finding little evidence, attention is turned to Iraq's so-called weapons of mass destruction. You call this episode the CIA's most significant intelligence failure. Tell us about that.
It was really a fiasco and caused lasting harm to not only to the CIA, but to the image of America, of the United States around the world. And I think it, as I said before, I think it ranks with the Bay of Pigs, the failure to realize that the Shah was about to fall. Those would certainly be the top three. And in this case, I do think that George Tenet and the CIA, as I said before, deserve credit for trying to blow the whistle on trying to warn about 9/11. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the CIA led a spectacularly successful invasion of Afghanistan, driving the Taliban from power. And obviously there were plenty of black marks as well. But WMD's is right at the top of the list. And a former CIA acting director told me that, he spends a lot of time on college campuses talking to students. And he said after 9/11, everything changed. There used to be a belief that the United States essentially was a force for good in the world, and that it changed after WMDs. That might overstate it somewhat, but I think it gets at just how pivotal that failure was. And, it's funny because I think I'm fair to George Tenet. I don't think it was a case of CIA Director Tenet and his allies cooking the books, as it were. And I asked him that question point blank, and he practically bolted from his chair, arguing that he really sincerely believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. I do think that it was sincere. I don't think this was a case of the CIA fixing it, but I do think they were tragically wrong.
Let's turn our attention to a couple of the chapters that you write about on more recent events. CIA Director John Brennan is at the helm when intelligence uncovers Russia's massive interference in the 2016 US presidential election, which we know Donald Trump denies. What did you learn from Director Brennan in your conversation? And then talk about the contentious relationship between the two.
Sure. Let me take it in reverse order, if you don't mind, because, excuse me, Brennan, there's no question about it that there's a tradition that former CIA directors stay above the fray. They very rarely, if ever, criticize a sitting US president. And John Brennan has taken that tradition and blown it to smithereens, as we all know. It's hard to imagine anybody more vociferous critic of Donald Trump. I would say to people, though, who question that or criticize Brennan, that it should tell you something when not only John Brennan, but also James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, Michael Hayden, former CIA director, William McRaven, who led the special operations mission that got Osama bin Laden, and a host of former national security officials, we could go on and on and on, have also said that Donald Trump is unfit for office. I will tell you that after the performance at Helsinki, when Donald Trump took the stage with Vladimir Putin and accepted the word of Putin over his own intelligence agencies about interference in the 2016 election, that one very senior CIA official told me, a guy who used to run Russian operations, he said, at that moment, I could think of no other possibility than that the Russians must have something on Donald Trump, either financial ties or compromise. He wasn't sure what, but in his view, and that's, I think, a view of a lot of high-ranking CIA officials, sadly. So my book opens with the scene is the August of 2016 when Brennan is in his office past midnight trying to put together this puzzle, looking at all the intelligence coming from Moscow. And there was no doubt in his mind, and I don't think there's any doubt in any serious investigator's mind, that the Russians were launching a massive assault on the US elections in 2016. It happened.
Final question before we turn to some audience questions that were emailed to us. We learn about the daily presidential briefing. That is
President's Daily Brief.
President's Daily Briefing is delivered each morning in person to the president, and every president consumes that intelligence in his own way. You told us that President Clinton wanted nothing to do with his daily
With Woolsey, yeah.
With Woolsey, right? You write that Obama liked to receive his on an iPad and make some notes in it. With respect to President Trump, it isn't so complimentary. You write that a senior official said he didn't listen, he didn't read, he wasn't even curious. So I'm wondering if this unconventional briefing cadence, if you can connect the dots at all to the COVID pandemic. You write about it in the book.
So as you know, Steve, I write a whole chapter about Donald Trump and his CIA directors, Mike Pompeo and Gina Haspel. And I was saying before, I think Gina Haspel is a fascinating character. And her story is sort of a thread throughout the book. because of course she was at the infamous black site in Thailand when some of the Al-Qaeda terrorists were being waterboarded, as we all know. But I should just, for the record, say about Bill Clinton, although he couldn't stand to be in the same room with Jim Woolsey, he devoured his PDB, the President's Daily Brief. And in fact, he would send back the most arcane notations and questions back to the CIA. And they would say to themselves, where does he get this stuff? I mean, Clinton was reading more material than his CIA briefers were reading. So he was obviously an unusual case. Donald Trump, on the other hand, is, as I wrote in the Washington Post recently, I did an op-ed in which I argued that the president is unbriefable. And that's a dangerous situation. No other president has ever simply ignored the president's daily brief, but Donald Trump doesn't read. He's incurious. He thinks he knows everything worth knowing. And so he brought with him, and he wasn't the first president, by the way, to do this, but he brought with him into office a contempt for the CIA. He was convinced that they were a deep state full of liberal enemies, as we all know. So he became really a case unto himself of a president who really did not follow the president's daily briefing. And in my opinion, we're suffering the catastrophic consequences of a president who ignored warnings in the PDB in January and February of a coronavirus that was headed our way.
Thank you. I want to turn our attention, Chris, to our members' questions. These were emailed to us in advance. And then I'll remind Christina, ask Christina to pop the link up again, the book link up in the chat room while we're doing this. But let's just continue with present day. Jim asks a question, DEC member Jim. What will be the biggest challenge for a CIA director in President Biden's administration?
Well, there are a lot of challenges ahead. And of course, one of the things that I think the CIA will pay a lot more attention to going forward, for obvious reasons, is the threat of pandemics. That's been principally the responsibility of CDC to warn about, although the CIA has played a supporting role. And as I've mentioned, it was in the PDB in January. So I think there'll be more emphasis on that. I think job number one for the new CIA director is to restore morale, because of course the CIA has been compared to Nazi Germany by Donald Trump. This has been a broken marriage from day one. And I think the CIA director has to be able to restore confidence and morale. But the other thing is to make sure that to repair the damage that's been done by the politicizing of the intelligence community. We have had, as Director of National Intelligence, the CIA director's nominal boss, in the form of John Ratcliffe, a partisan hack who, for no Trump falsehood was too outrageous for him to repeat in public. He's been certainly politicizing intelligence since he was in that job. So I think Biden is off to a good start. He's got Avril Haines, who is really respected in the job as Director of National Intelligence. But it'll be really interesting to see who his CIA director is. I think the likelihood that Gina Haspel continues is very slim. But Avril Haines is not necessarily, wouldn't have been everybody's first choice. She was certainly involved in Obama's reluctance to prosecute some of the officials who were in charge of waterboarding, for example, and in charge of torture. So she's got some weakness. Certainly, she's unpopular among some progressives. So it'll be interesting to see who the choice is for Biden. I hope it's somebody like Panetta, who is really somebody with gravitas, who can tell Joe Biden hard truths.
Chris, DEC member Matt asks a question. How do you think the American public today looks at the CIA? What are the thoughts on the CIA today?
Well, I think it's mixed. I think that, as I say, that the WMD fiasco had a long-lasting and very damaging effect, I think, on the credibility of the CIA. And we saw it in how effective Donald Trump's attacks were during the 2016 election, when he said that these are the guys who brought you WMDs in Iraq. That's still a really powerful and potent line of attack. I think it has not gone away. It certainly affected the CIA's integrity. Donald Trump's attacks on the intelligence community as a deep state for the last 4 years, relentlessly, I think has taken a toll. And I think the irony here is that the CIA really, over the years, hasn't been a rogue elephant, in the late Frank Church's famous words. It's really been kind of a check on rogue presidents. That's kind of the irony. When Richard Nixon wanted Dick Helms to participate in the Watergate cover-up and call off the FBI, Helms stood up to Nixon and for the rule of law. When Donald Trump tried to shake down the president of Ukraine for dirt on a political rival, it was a CIA whistleblower who stood up and blew the whistle on that. So to me, it's ironic. And I think that the CIA has a lot of work to do to restore its credibility.
Let's finish up, Chris. You've got another amazing chapter in the book that covers the untold story of the CIA's biggest manhunt ever. Can you spend a minute or two on that?
It's an amazing story. And it's a very little known story, but for decades, the most wanted terrorist in the world, certainly by Mossad and the CIA, was not Osama bin Laden, but Imad Mignia, who was the operations chief of Hezbollah, who had lots of American and Israeli blood in his hands, who was thought to be behind the bombing of the American embassy in Beirut as early as 1983, when he was just a kid. And for decades, he was the diabolical and elusive mastermind of Hezbollah's attacks. He was finally killed in an incredible hair-raising operation in Damascus in 2008. It was a joint American CIA and Mossad operation in which the CIA built the bomb and Mossad pulled the trigger, essentially. And I have an untold story of how the CIA almost got Mignia a decade earlier in Beirut, but that operation went south. So it's, again, I say, this is a cast of characters Le Carré couldn't have dreamed up. It's also true of some of these wild covert operations.
Thank you, Chris. Well, a huge thank you, Chris, for being with us. Continued good luck with the book. Again, Christina can pop the link up one last time. Folks, I'd encourage you. It's a great read, really good read. So, Chris, we hope to have you with us again in person one day in the future.
I hope I can come out there one of these days. I hope I'll take you up on that for sure, Steve. Thanks so much.
Sounds good. I'd also like to thank my team and all of you for being with us, and we hope to see you at an upcoming meeting in December, or if not, the Michigan Economic Outlook meeting on January 12th. Have a terrific week, everybody. Stay safe. Have a great day.
Take care.
Goodbye.